Welcome, welcome, welcome to a special edition of the 3DownNation podcast because, fellas, in the Canadian Football League, moves do not get much bigger than this. It's official. The Ottawa Redblacks have hired Ryan Dinwiddie away from the Toronto Argonauts as the team's head coach and general manager. It is a move, fellas, that we talked about on the podcast, and we should let the people know that sometimes, most of the time, the things that we talk about on the podcast are for a reason, right, John Hodge and JC Abbott?
Are you saying we don't just talk out of our asses? Is that what you're saying?
Wait, I was told by multiple people and other podcasts that this was never going to happen.
Yeah, I was told
apparently.
I was told I was a joke and doing clickbait for putting Ryan Dinwiddie in my head coach article for the Ottawa Redblacks, but I guess we got lucky on this one. Maybe.
Clickbait. Everybody does clickbait these days, okay? Let's just do away with that term. But there is a real reason why we talked about it, as you guys alluded to jokingly, that there was actual legs to this being a possibility for multiple reasons. Ryan Dinwiddie, guys, has told, I believe, us directly at 3DownNation that he has been interested in potentially being a general manager in the Canadian Football League, along with the head coach one day down the line. That day has come with the Ottawa Redblacks, and let's get part of the facts of this straight, okay? Because there's some Argonauts fans going, well, how can Ryan Dinwiddie leave as a head coach and go to the Ottawa Redblacks and we get nothing? Well, it's simple. It's because it's for a promotion. He's going to be the head coach and general manager. Michael Pinball Clemens continues to hold that title with the Toronto Argonauts, so Dinwiddie is allowed to go to the nation's capital if he so chooses, and that's what happened here. So let's start with it from Ottawa's perspective first. For me, this is a huge get by OSEG. Credit to them, the ownership group, and Sean Burke for taking the vice president football operations job and even making this a possibility. You talk to people around the league, and it seems to be pretty close to unanimous, if not actually unanimous, that Ryan Dinwiddie is the best play caller in the Canadian Football League and is right now at the top of his game among coaches in the league at developing quarterbacks. Like, just look at what he did with Nick Arbuckle. All due respect to Mr. Arbuckle this season. That was impressive. So I think that this move shows OSEG, and more importantly, the Redblacks fans, that the Ottawa Redblacks mean business. Fellas, John Hodge, what say you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's obvious why the Redblacks wanted to do this. There's not a lot of offensive minds that are available in the Canadian Football League, right? If you look at the coaching candidate articles that we've produced, it's mostly defensive people, a slurry of, special teams guys. Not to say that defensive and special teams guys can't become great head coaches, but offense, right, is what sells tickets, and it's tough to win football games, right, if you can't put points up on the board. And Ryan Dinwiddie has shown that he can take guys like Chad Kelly, who have been out of football for stints, and turn them into MOPs. He can take Nick Arbuckle, a guy who is seen as a total bust, and turn him into a 4,000-yard passer. So whether Drew Brown stays the guy in Ottawa, he is under contract for 2026. I don't see any reason why Ryan Dinwiddie couldn't turn him into a 5,000-yard receiver, right? Or it's possible that now there's a ripple effect and, quarterback. It's possible there's a ripple effect and the Redblacks now try to pry Chad Kelly or Nick Arbuckle out of Toronto. Both those guys are under contract for 2026. So the Argonauts could keep both, but who knows, right? And I think as far as the Argonauts go, because I think a lot of people will say, well, why would you not keep Ryan Dinwiddie if you're the Argonauts? Well, the team won 5 games this year, right? I think clearly behind the scenes, there must have been some level of conflict between Pinball and John Murphy, who run that personnel department in Toronto, and Dinwiddie himself. And Dinwiddie was only under contract through 2026. So do you give him a contract extension coming off a poor year, or do you let him walk and wipe the slate clean? I had a source tell me that Toronto's coaching staff Many of them were under contract for 2026, but there was a clause in the deal that if head coach Ryan Dinwiddie was not back, then the 2026 year, those extensions was wiped out. So in other words, the contracts in 2026 for the Argonauts assistants could essentially be done. And by the way, in Ottawa, the only head assistant coach under contract for 2026 is William Fields, who was the defensive coordinator where in 2024? Toronto. So we know William Fields and Ryan Dinwiddie jive. They won a Grey Cup together. Say that again, Justin.
Co-defensive coordinator in 24?
Well, co-defensive coordinator, fair enough. But the point is, I think if he wants to, Ryan Dinwiddie could potentially look to bring a bunch of his assistants over to Ottawa. And if that's the case, I mean, on the one hand, if you're Toronto, you don't necessarily want to lose talented coaches. On the other hand, depending on the new head coaches, a good selling point could be, hey, we've got 2 quarterbacks who you can win with, and you can bring in your entire staff, all the assistants that you want. You're not saddled with people you don't necessarily want to work with. So I think it makes sense for all parties. The Argonauts don't have to extend a head coach coming off a poor season. They get to wipe the slate clean, and they can rebuild with someone new who I can imagine. I'll let JC talk to it, but I can imagine who the top candidate is on their list. And we know he's available. You don't need permission to talk to him.
I think the important thing to note with both this situation and where we might be looking for future head coaches, if you're the Toronto Argonauts, is not all marriages are as happy behind the scenes once the doors close to the house as they are when they're out in public winning football games. And I think that's the case here with Ryan Dinwiddie and the Toronto head office. All you had to do here to keep Ryan Dinwiddie around, in my opinion, is hand him the keys like Ottawa's handed him the keys, right? Make him the general manager. Pinball Clemens, who, for all our respect for what he's accomplished in the CFL, we've talked about before, is more of a figurehead as a GM, less of a boots on the ground general manager in terms of player evaluation and scouting and acquisition. He could have easily gone back into a VP role and let Ryan Dinwiddie have that GM title, keeping him in Toronto. They decided not to do that, right? With Pinball Clemens staying as the GM and John Murphy staying in his role as well. They didn't want to hand the keys to Dinwiddie, and that suggests that they weren't exactly aligned on what they felt the future of that organization was going to be. And so Sean Burke takes that step back and says, hey, I'll take a little bit of job security, sign me through 2028. I'll take what's a promotion on paper and become vice president, but I will give the keys to that roster management to land the best head coach in the CFL right now. I think that is a savvy move from him to set that ego aside a little bit and let somebody take over. And it signals to everyone else in the league that they mean business. Now, on the flip side of that marriage equation, who could the Toronto Argonauts be looking at? And I think there is nobody else that Pinball Clemens would rather take on a date right now than Mike O'Shea, right? That is somebody he's coveted for a long time, his friend, his teammate. They're very close, and he's on an expiring contract in Winnipeg. And the reality is, as good as the Bombers have been, going to 5 straight Grey Cups and that run ending this year, there's often been a little bit of a disconnect between Mike O'Shea and the Winnipeg front office led by general manager Kyle Walters. And some of that was insulated when Ted Gavaya was there as the general manager, but he left for Hamilton and, of course, sadly passed away. That
assistant
protection,
GM.
yes,
Gavaya
assistant GM. He has since left and then sadly passed away. That insulation is no longer there. So if you're Mike O'Shea and your contract is expiring, your protection in that front office or the guy you trusted is no longer in place, and you've got your close buddy with a job opening ready for you, somebody you know you can work with and whose character you trust, I don't know why you wouldn't jump ship now and head back to Ontario to the team you used to play for.
And you go to the Argos team that holds their training camp where? At your university alma mater, the University of Guelph. Now, I'm not saying that's the reason that he would go back to the Toronto Argonauts, but these are just easy, simple connections. Michael O'Shea and Pinball Clemens have won, I believe, fellas, multiple Grey Cups together as players.
Yeah, that's
And
correct.
definitely have adoration for each other. So that would make a lot of sense. You would have to imagine that the Argos would not just let Dinwiddie walk off the ship without having the next captain in mind, so to speak. And there's one main point I want to make about Dinwiddie going to Ottawa, because I think it can benefit him in a couple major ways from a couple people that he's going to work with there. The front office is largely intact. Sean Burke continues there. He's essentially been a general manager for two franchises. With the Hamilton Tiger Cats, did a lot of those roles, even though it was deemed in some unusual ways, I guess, in terms of the titles they had that were so long there in Hamilton. And then he's been with the Ottawa Redblacks. And as much as people will bang on Sean Burke for the team's demise, especially being last place in the East Division in 2025, he was there to help them get back to the playoffs for the first time in a little while in 2024. So Dinwiddie can draw on that experience as a general manager. And I think one of the other key connections is Brendan Taman being there, a way back playback for some people. But Taman actually signed Ryan Dinwiddie to his first Canadian Football League contract. And that was as part of a regime that was building a team, as Hodge will well know, that went to the Grey Cup in 2007. And Dinwiddie ultimately started that game, lost to the Saskatchewan Roughriders. Taman went on to build a Grey Cup championship winning team in 2013 in Saskatchewan. So he might not have done it for a while, but Brendan Taman knows how to put those teams together. And if you're Ryan Dinwiddie sitting there, you're going, okay, I can go and be a, quote, first-time GM, because we know we can get it done as a head coach and a play caller, but I can go to the nation's capital, be a first-time GM, learn from Sean Burke, and then also learn from Brendan Taman, who has a Grey Cup championship, arguably the most famous Grey Cup championship, definitely in Saskatchewan Roughriders history. I was going to say league history. There's probably an argument there for that. And a guy that's put together championship rosters. So from that perspective, it also makes sense. And that's part of the draw to go to the Ottawa Redblacks.
Well, let's talk about Mike O'Shea some more. This is a guy who's from North Bay. His wife is from Milton. And people close to O'Shea have told me that he still talks about how eventually he wants to end up back in Ontario at some point. And that's not to say he doesn't like Winnipeg. He made it exorbitantly clear during his end-of-year media availability in Winnipeg on Monday that he loves Winnipeg. He hasn't left. It's a great community. It's a great football town, all those things. He's obviously had a ton of success as the head coach of the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. He's the club's winningest head coach ever. He is in now the top 10 for CFL all-time wins as a head coach. Been to 5 Grey Cups, winning 2 of them. That being said, I think it's no secret that the least favorite part of being a head coach for Mike O'Shea is dealing with the media. That is not a big problem in Toronto, whereas in Winnipeg, that is a huge part of the job, right?
It's almost no problem in Toronto.
If you're a media shy head coach, Toronto's a great place for you. You probably don't want to be in Winnipeg or Regina. So I'm not saying that Mike O'Shea is going to leave. Again, as I said on our pod just a few days ago, based on a season-ending press conference, I thought there was a very high chance that Mike O'Shea was going to come back. However, that was under the context of the Ottawa job being available and Toronto being filled. I think with those situations now reversed, which we knew was a possibility, but it wasn't confirmed yet, obviously, I think that changes. I'm not saying Mike O'Shea's gone to Toronto, but what I am saying is it seems like a pretty seamless fit. I asked O'Shea directly if his assistants were under contract, and he claimed that he could not remember. Now, I don't believe that's the truth for a second. I think that was his way of saying, I'm not telling you that. So I am left to speculate. I'd imagine a bunch of Winnipeg's assistants are without a contract for 2026. And if that's being the case, what's to stop Mike O'Shea from saying, hey, let's all catch a flight east and run this back in Toronto with Mike Pinball Clemens as our GM. Now, obviously, that would leave Winnipeg with a bunch of openings that might not come to pass. So we'll move away from the speculation there. But as for the rest of the candidates, I've got 14 up, at 3downnation.com. I've already received multiple text messages clowning me for having that many, but I thought it was valid to have 14. Mike O'Shea, I think, is number one on the list if I were to speculate that. But I also think a guy like Jarius Jackson, who has ties to John Murphy, who has coached in Toronto, has played in Toronto, was Winnipeg's quarterbacks coach this past season, but did a great job as the interim head coach at Edmonton in 2024. I think would be a nice fit. There's also some really nice options on the staff right now. Guys like Mike Miller, who's been an NFL OC, who's done a great job with the quarterbacks there. A guy like Mickey Donovan, who's had some great special teams units and has spent 20 years in Canadian football. You want to talk about Kevin Iben, a guy who bleeds double blue, has spent over 2 decades in that organization as an all CFL linebacker and has coached, as a co-defensive coordinator, as a special teams coordinator, a great leader, a good communicator. Like, there's a bunch of guys in that building who I think could be internal candidates, but there are also some good external candidates. I think you have to mention Mark Mueller, right? We've talked about the limited number of offensive options. Mueller's arguably the top one available. So check out the full article for a breakdown of all 14. But those are a handful of guys who I think are worth mentioning on the pod.
Yeah, when you're looking at offensive or when you're looking at potential head coaches, you have to look at offense because otherwise it's a too hire job. If you're hiring a defensive or special teams minded head coach, then you've also got to find who their OC is in what is admittedly a very limited pool of top offensive minds out there in the CFL. And to me, Mike Miller is a very compelling name as an internal candidate because the other element with this is what's going on with Chad Kelly. We all know that he has not played this past season because of his injury. He was a guy who was very close with Ryan Dinwiddie. They worked together. Does Dinwiddie want to try and bring him over to Ottawa via trade? Has Toronto grown dissatisfied with Kelly's antics over the last year or his unwillingness to get on the field if they perceive it as such? Potentially. And then maybe he's heading over to Ottawa. But if they want to keep him in the building, it would make sense to make that head coach somebody he trusts and somebody he wants to play for. And I think the way that Chad Kelly has spoken about Mike Miller in the past, that is that guy. He's somebody who he has tremendous respect for, who he felt the absence of when he was not with them in 2023. Well, he was dealing with some personal matters, right? That was part of the reason why they floundered in the playoffs, as he pointed to the absence of Mike Miller leading up to that game as a reason why he struggled before he suffered that alleged head injury. And I think he would love to see him in a head coaching seat, and that might make it a more satisfactory arrangement for them going forward. I think you also have to look at guys like Mark Mueller and Jarius Jackson. Jarius Jackson, of course, has connections in Toronto, and I think Mark Mueller is the best up-and-coming name as an offensive coordinator and somebody who has a head coaching type of pedigree. Those 3 guys, to me, are the best candidates if you can't steal Mike O'Shea away from Winnipeg.
Let's try to tie it up on Mike O'Shea for a moment, fellas, because I think it's worth talking about a couple of things in terms of O'Shea. First of all, the leverage that he potentially has right now is massive in Winnipeg and Toronto, right? That's the ideal CFL scenario, be it a free agent, a coach, a general manager who's wanted. You can really bump up the price tag and also your influence and say over what happens on your football team. To your point, JC, that you're getting at, and Hodge, you too, from an offensive perspective, you would have to think that that's going to be one of the questions to O'Shea. Well, if you're potentially coming to Toronto, who's your offensive coordinator going to be? But that's also, from what I'm hearing, a major question in Winnipeg. If Mike O'Shea stayed in Winnipeg, is Jason Hogan going to continue as your offensive coordinator, or is it going to be someone else? So I think there are a number of iterations that could potentially work out. As much as I could see, and people might think it's a long shot, Jarius Jackson as a legitimate head coach candidate for the Argos. If Mike O'Shea goes to Toronto, perhaps Jarius Jackson is his offensive coordinator after getting to know each other a little bit better for a year. I don't want to get too much into the speculation game, fellas, but I think it's worth noting here because people didn't think that the Ryan Dinwiddie move could ever happen, right? As we talked about off the top, people laughed at us, wondered why we were talking about it, why John Hodge had his name on his Ottawa Redblacks head coaching candidates list. Well, the people behind the scenes more and more are talking about some of this stuff. So let's just play the game a little bit. Okay, let's say Mike O'Shea does go to Toronto. Well, what do the Winnipeg Blue Bombers do? I think there's a great opportunity there, potentially, for a stable franchise that sold out 14 regular season games in a row and is presumably making money to go after a young offensive mind. I would think that could make a lot of sense potentially for Mark Mueller. And by the way, Hodge, as you pointed out astutely, Trevor Harris is a pending free agent. That would put Trevor Harris in a great situation, if there's multiple teams that want him, and we're sort of playing this quarterback carousel game at the moment, so you can kind of see where I'm going with it. If Chad Kelly ends up in Ottawa, Zach Collaros somehow ends up going with Mike O'Shea to Toronto, does that create that situation in Winnipeg? So I'm saying these things that we don't usually talk about on the podcast because it's what people are talking about behind the scenes, and it's that time of year. I'm not saying that any of these things are going to happen for sure. The Ryan Dinwiddie move was much different. It was way too loud behind the scenes to just ignore. And it's why I think all of us felt like that was the move that Ottawa needed to make to really put themselves on the map and be a competitive football team.
I think your point, Dunk, this has the potential to be a massive domino, right? Ryan Dinwiddie moving from Toronto to Ottawa. We only had one head coach opening this year. Now this could trickle in to potentially two different openings, right? Toronto's open now, potentially Winnipeg open after, and then the quarterback carousel or the offensive coordinator carousel that will follow from those moves. We will see this affect rosters all over the CFL based on who is going to fill these roles, who wants to go where, who wants to follow their coaches, and who they bring with them if they're a quarterback and they want to bring other offensive weapons from around the league. This could be, and I would say this is the biggest move that I've seen in my time following the CFL, just in terms of what the potential ramifications are for every other franchise in terms of the trickle down.
And I don't think it's impossible. If Mike O'Shea does end up as the head coach in Toronto, he could have Mike Miller become his OC, and he could bring special teams coordinator Mike Miller over from Winnipeg, which means he's only one Mike Miller away from having three Mike Miller coordinators. I don't know if there's a DC out there whose name is Mike Miller, but that would be so CFL to have one team with multiple coordinators named Mike Miller. That would be wild. But I agree with you, JC. I don't think it's hyperbolic to say that this could be the trigger point for the most exciting run of offseason moves we've seen in a decade. Like really, like we're seeing two teams like Winnipeg and Toronto are 1 year removed from playing in the Grey Cup. 51 weeks ago, that's what they were doing. And right now, both of them could be making head coaching changes with obvious overlap between the two clubs. So it's possible the domino kind of stops with just Mike O'Shea re-upping in Winnipeg. It's status quo in Bomberland, and the Argos, do a search, and that's that. But I agree. If Mike O'Shea is the next cog or the next key to fall, there are going to be a ton of dominoes. And I would not at all be surprised if Mike O'Shea goes to Toronto. Zach Collaros, who his offseason home is Aurora, Ontario, he's in the GTA. It wouldn't shock me at all if that was there. And then who's the quarterback in Winnipeg? Is it Drew Brown who comes back? Because if Chad Kelly's in Ottawa, one would assume that Drew Brown is probably not back in Ottawa. So there's a million different pieces here that could be moving, could be flowing. And I think, Justin, you're smart to mention Trevor Harris, because if the next great GM that people talk about is Kyle Carson, who was a finalist for the job in Hamilton. Well, if Kyle Carson's the GM in Winnipeg, he brings in Mark Mueller. Why wouldn't they then bring in Trevor Harris? I'm sure there's a ton of fans in Bomberland who'd be happy to have them pick the Riders' pockets, especially if the Riders win a Grey Cup in their building in just a few short days. So this has been a great emergency pod. We'll obviously talk at least a little bit more about it on our show next week, though obviously we'll have hopefully 2 very exciting playoff games to talk about as well. Oh,